I think you have a government in Israel today, which is an extremist government, whose cabinet members are committed to the expulsion of the Palestinians from their land and to create a greater Israel.
Many countries of the global south have long argued that the Security Council and the UN sort of structure itself is perhaps not relevant anymore.
When the United Nations was created, there were 55 members.
Correct.
Today, there are 193 members. So the broader membership requires broader representation in the Security Council, so therefore the Security Council should be expanded. The paralysis of the Security Council, the inability of the Security Council to act, is not correlated to the representation on the Security Council. It is related to the veto power of the 5 permanent members.
What is Pakistan's precise position on the two-state, one-state solution?
First of all, is dictated by the principle of self-determination.
Correct.
Self-determination is a core principle of the UN Charter, and this is the principle on the basis of which most of the countries, members of the United Nations, have achieved independence.
I'm delighted to be joined by Ambassador Munir Akram, who needs no introduction, Pakistan's long-time senior distinguished diplomat, currently the permanent representative to the UN, and who has served in many capacities. And today it's a real honor, sir, to be with you and your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Without further ado, I would like to begin by the crisis that has engulfed the world and the Middle Eastern region. And of course, every person, every thinking and humane person is concerned about the brutal treatment of Palestinian people at the hands of Israeli state. And perhaps the biggest question, sir, and I will refer to some of your very bold remarks and positions at the United Nations as to why the Security Council has been unable to intervene in this disaster and in this real gross violation of people's rights.
Well, as we all know, the Security Council operates on the basis of agreement or the assent of its 5 permanent members, who each one of them has a right of veto. And traditionally, Israel has had the protection of at least one of the permanent members of the Council, and that is why we have had a paralysis in the actions that the Security Council is able to take on the Middle East issue. And in this present war that is taking place in Gaza, again, Israel has had the support of the United States and the vote of the United States, and that's why the Security Council has actually adopted 2 resolutions, but neither of those 2 resolutions included a call for a ceasefire in Gaza.
That's right.
So that, in simple terms, that is the cause of the paralysis of the Security Council. But even more than that, I think you have a government in Israel today, which is an extremist government, whose cabinet members are committed to the expulsion of the Palestinians from their land and to create a greater Israel. So even if there was a resolution from the Security Council, it would still remain a challenge to oblige the government in Israel to implement those Security Council resolutions. So there is a double jeopardy here.
Correct. And sir, so this leads me to the other question that, many countries of the global south have long argued that the Security Council and the UN sort of structure itself is perhaps not relevant anymore. It was a very particular time period when the UN came into being post Second World War, and given these challenges that we face, this veto power by the powerful and rich countries of the world. So, I mean, what efforts can we make to reform this architecture? Especially expanding the Security Council, getting more permanent members. Diluting or addressing this veto power. So what, as someone who's both served as a diplomat but also knows the UN really well, so we'd like to know, what would you suggest?
Well, first of all, it is correct that the Security Council is no longer representative of the broader membership of the United Nations. When the United Nations created, there were 55 members.
Correct.
Today, there are 193 members. So the broader membership requires broader representation in the Security Council, so therefore the Security Council should be expanded. But the solution which some have suggested, which is that we should add more permanent members, is not a solution, in my view, because the paralysis of the Security Council, the inability of the Security Council to act, is not correlated to the representation on the Security Council. It is related to the veto power of the 5 permanent members. And so long as that veto power is there, adding more permanent members would only multiply the possibilities of paralysis. Because if you have 5 vetoes and you have paralysis, if you have 10 or 11 or 12 vetoes, that paralysis will become even more probable, just mathematically. Each one of those 12 will have its own interests and then will exercise the right of veto, and therefore the Security Council will be ineffective. The solution which we have proposed, Pakistan and Italy, our coalition, which is called the Uniting for Consensus Coalition, we have proposed that the Council should only expand into the non-permanent members.
Right.
And there should be an additional 11 or 12 members of the Security Council. And these should be mostly small and medium-sized countries, which are the large majority in the United Nations membership.
Right.
So that would give it representation. As far as the veto power is concerned, the only way to counteract the veto power is for the larger membership, for the non-permanent members, to also have the ability to block decisions.
That's right.
And if there is a larger membership, say a membership of 27 in the Security Council, which we have proposed, and the majority required for passing a resolution is 16 or 17 votes, most of those 16 or 17 votes will be the small and medium countries, and they will therefore have a countervailing power vis-a-vis the permanent members. And that is the way in which the influence of the permanent members could be diluted, and the ability of the larger membership of the United Nations to be able to influence decisions could be enhanced.
Right, right. That's certainly a very unique and practical proposal. But let's see whether this kind of support can be garnered within the system. But coming back to the Palestinian crisis, and what is Pakistan's precise position on the 2-state, 1-state solution, and what because you have been arguing the case for the Palestinians in recent months. So, what has been the sort of centerpiece of this our position?
Well, our position, first of all, is dictated by the principle of self-determination.
Correct.
Self-determination is a core principle of the UN Charter, and this is the principle on the basis of which most of the countries, members of the United Nations, have achieved independence.
Right.
Pakistan itself is the child of the exercise of the right of self-determination by the Muslims of South Asia. Therefore, we have always supported the principle. This principle is also the basis for our position on Jammu and Kashmir, which is a key and critical issue for Pakistan. It's a national cause. And therefore, it has been quite natural for Pakistan right from the start. Even as we were born, we argued for the right of self-determination for the Palestinian people.
That's right.
And we have continued to do that consistently over the years. Even though the fortunes of the Palestinians have suffered, the state which they were supposed to achieve in 1947 was truncated by the Nakba, by the expulsion of the Palestinians. Territories were grabbed. And then in 1967, Israel conquered the whole of what was then Palestine.
Correct.
Yes. So today, we are calling for the only viable solution, which is to create the two states which were promised in Resolution 181 of the General Assembly, which created Israel and Palestine.
Correct.
And we are asking for the implementation of that resolution. We are asking for the Palestinian people to be able to exercise the right of self-determination, create their own country, create their own state, which can then coexist with Israel. This is the two-state solution. It is supported by the entire international community. It is only opposed by the extremists who are governing Israel.
Yes, sir. So I'll come to the Jammu and Kashmir issue later, but I'll go back to the Palestinian crisis as well. So one particular question that many raise is that if Pakistan had recognized Israel, would Pakistan be more effective in pushing our position or having more impact? I mean, I know it's a very tricky question, but many people have argued that. So I'm just articulating,
Yeah, it's obviously a hypothetical situation, but let me transpose that to say that Israel's largest and most important benefactor is the United States.
Correct.
The United States has not only recognized Israel, but it has subsidized Israel. And its support is vital for the existence of Israel. And the United States has been urging for a ceasefire over the past few weeks at least. But the Israelis have not listened to even the United States. It's the largest benefactor. So if Pakistan had recognized Israel, what influence do you think we would have to push them?
Yeah. I mean, hypothetically, you're right about the American analogy, and also I think the French and the Brits and others by extension. But this debate has been ongoing. I mean, even before October 7, when Hamas launched its attacks, about and in Pakistan's domestic politics as well, it has emerged. There's of course a divided opinion on that. But what do you think? Do you foresee in the years to come? Should Pakistan follow that line, or would because the rational argument is yes, we should, we could, and have perhaps reimagined the future. But then there's a lot of emotional baggage when it comes to the question of recognizing Israel. So, what would you say to?
Well, I think first of all there is a question of justice and equity. I think so long as Israel is in occupation of Palestine and suppressing the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, and Pakistan being committed to the right of self-determination globally, not only for Palestine, not only for Kashmir. We have supported this principle in Algeria, in Morocco, in Tunisia, and all the countries which emerged out of colonialism. Pakistan was a flag bearer of the principle of self-determination. Therefore, on the basis of justice, of equity, Pakistan should not allow its principle to be compromised by the power or the influence that Israel wields in the world, because it is an unjust occupation of Palestine. Once the Palestinian issue is solved, the Palestinian people are allowed to have the right to self-determination in a state of their own. Once they normalize relations with the Palestinians, with the Arabs, with other countries, that would be a time for Pakistan to consider whether Israel has got sufficient legitimacy to deserve recognition.
Right. So, of course, Ambassador, you have talked about self-determination, and we talked about Jammu and Kashmir. But before that, I mean, even Kashmir's situation is pretty similar in the sense that, the occupation there, and there are UN resolutions tabled and approved, and India does not really budge. And you've been a long-time advocate for the people of Jammu and Kashmir and Pakistan government's position on that. But overall, isn't the human rights system that the UN sort of promotes, and it's a pillar of the UN and central to UN Charter as well, I mean, this whole crisis and the Kashmir has also kind of exposed the fact that UN's emphasis on upholding international human rights law is greatly challenged by these two festering issues, where basically it's ineffective in doing anything. I mean, what would you say to that? Because a lot of countries say, and of course these are the flashpoints, but there are so many other international human rights violations, I mean, including countries like our country, Pakistan, where occasionally these things are reported. But, the UN's effectiveness is also at question in this field. I mean, we talked about security, but here if you just focus on rights itself,
So I think one has to look at each situation in its specificity. Palestine and Kashmir are similar in many respects, with foreign occupation, with the suppression of the right of self-determination as such. And what we say is that the right of self-determination is a foundational right.
Right.
Because if you don't have the right of self-determination, you cannot enjoy other rights, such as political rights, civil rights, economic rights as such. And therefore, it is fundamental that people are not suppressed by foreign occupation or foreign intervention, and their right to self-determination suppressed. So that whether the United Nations' capability to enforce these rights, the United Nations by itself does not have an army, does not have the capacity to actually enforce its decisions. That enforcement comes through collective action under Article 51 of the Charter, which provides that you can use force either in self-defense or through a collective decision of the Security Council to enforce a particular measure or decision. And enforcement actions have been taken where all the Security Council members could agree on what those actions should be against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. In other situations, there have been agreements, whether right or wrong, but the Security Council has been able to agree on enforcement. But with regard to both Kashmir and Palestine, the Security Council has been prevented by the exercise of the veto to be able to decide on enforcement action. So until we are able to convince the Security Council to collectively decide on enforcement action against two powerful armies, the Israeli army is powerful, enforcement action is not going to be simple. And similarly, in Kashmir, with the Indian army, which is also powerful, enforcement action would be a challenge as such. So therefore, in situations where human rights or collective decisions cannot be imposed through enforcement action, the United Nations has an array of other measures such as economic sanctions, boycotts, trade, etc., expulsion from international bodies. These are kind of secondary enforcement measures to persuade countries which are in violation of the international consensus that they should come and adhere. Sometimes it works. For example, in the case of apartheid in South Africa, it worked. That sanctions and expulsion and isolation were utilized in order to convince the South African government to change course and come on board. And similarly, there have been several other instances of that nature. So the limitations of the United Nations are built into the Charter, and we have to work within those limitations in order to get enforcement of our decisions.
Right. So going back to the issue of Jammu and Kashmir, we have a new government now being formed in Pakistan, and the political party that is going to lead the government has time and again talked about the necessity of resumption of talks with India on trade and issues such as Jammu and Kashmir as well. But the ground reality is that after the revocation of Article 370 by the Modi government in India, what options do we have to get this? We talked about the right of self-determination and, of course, justice and equity. Isn't like Pakistan's options for a constructive dialogue with India are now limited after these developments? I mean, what would you say?
Certainly, I think the limitation in our relationship with India arises not only because of the revocation of Article 370, although this has reduced the space for diplomatic engagement, for diplomatic compromise as such. But the root cause is the nature of the government in India. And the relationship with India has deteriorated since the Modi government has taken power and embarked on very aggressive posture towards the Kashmiris, towards Pakistan, and towards its own Muslim minority community. It is a government that is impelled by the ideology of Hindutva, which is an exclusionary ideology. It borders on fascism, and therefore it makes it very difficult for those countries which have the sense of self-respect, which have the sense of their own national identity and a commitment to principles. It becomes very difficult to negotiate with this government in India. We have to therefore, obviously, in diplomacy, dialogue should never be refused.
Correct.
And
absolutely.
If there is an opening for dialogue, we should have dialogue. But the dialogue should be directed towards redressing injustice and establishing the basis on which a just solution can be found to Jammu and Kashmir, a basis on which Pakistan is not threatened by the use of force by India as we are being threatened, a basis on which there is also justice for the 200 million Muslims of India.
Of India, yes. So I just have a couple of more questions. One is, of course, linked to this Indian question and the opening or the space for diplomatic engagement. I think one thing that Prime Minister Modi has rather cleverly done is that he has built these alliances or economic and other relationships with the countries in Gulf, which were historically and traditionally and still are actually allies of Pakistan, countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, etc. And, and I know I should not be delving into OIC questions with you because, I mean, that's not your remit. But, in a way, have we not really, where do you think we have faltered in forging those alliances with the fellow Muslim countries? Because there's a split, even when it comes to Palestine or it comes to India. Because if you remember, right after the revocation of Article 370, Modi embarked on a long tour where he went to UAE and he was garlanded. He went to Palestinian Authority, to Qatar, to Saudi Arabia later. So, obviously he was trying to do some messaging for his, people at home, but to us as well, I think. So, do you think we could have had an alternative foreign policy direction in this regard?
Well, you see, firstly, I would say that our relationships with the Gulf countries remain solid.
Yes.
We have bonds of faith and of culture and belief, which I think override other considerations as such. So I think that foundation of our relationships remains as such. But you should also see it from their point of view that India is a large country. India is one of the largest importers of oil, which is what
Correct.
The Gulf countries sell. It is a large market, perhaps the biggest market for some of them, or second biggest market for some of them. So on the basis of that compulsion to sell their product, this is the market that they have to sell. China and India are the two biggest markets where oil is sold today in the world. So looking at it from their point of view, they have to have a relationship, whether it's good, what dimensions of good, but it cannot be bad because that is in their national interest to have that good relation. And we have to understand that. We have to understand their compulsion. They are not developing relations with India in order to spite Pakistan or to denigrate Pakistan. They're doing it in their national interest as such. What we should be doing is developing our economy, developing our market so that we are also an attractive place to do business in and be able to balance what the Indians are doing as such. So I think we should look at it from that point of view. We should look at it introspectively in terms of how we can make ourselves much more attractive to third countries, not only the Gulf, but to the entire world. We should be an attractive market, we should be a stable economy, we should be a strong country that people look up to and respect and want to have good relations, economic, social, cultural, and political.
Right. So, I have a long list, but let me just conclude with the very important, because let's move from South Asia back to the international arena and climate change, which is, of course, one of the biggest threats that we as a world community face. Pakistan has been, participating in different negotiations, on climate financing, the loss and damage fund, which was, I think Pakistan's diplomatic efforts yielded fruit. So, can you tell us a little bit more about what Pakistan has been arguing at the UN, and what is our position, and where do you think that is headed?
Well, first of all, Pakistan is one of the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change. And we saw that in 2022 with those epic floods which hit us, which created damage of 30 billion plus to the Pakistani economy. And we then, obviously, the government at that time mobilized ourselves with the help of the Secretary General to mobilize the resources for reconstruction as such. But we also, beyond the reconstruction, we built a plan which is still on the table, a plan for resilience.
Right.
To rebuild Pakistan with greater resilience. And this is a huge plan which is still there, and which we will obviously, with the government coming in, it was in fact Mr. Shahbaz Sharif who was at that time leading the government as well, when this resilience plan was formulated. And we will pursue this resilience plans to build ourselves better in order to sustain future disasters if such happen to Pakistan. So that's our first priority. At the global level, we led the way in the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund. That fund has now become operational at COP28 in Dubai. $780 million have been committed to it. This is still not sufficient because the damage that is caused by climate change annually is over $12-13 billion globally as such. So this fund has to be a much larger fund in order to compensate countries for the loss and damage which they suffer, developing countries mostly who will suffer. Secondly, we have to have the ability to transition from what is today the fossil fuel economy to a green economy. And that transition is a difficult transition, especially for developing countries, because we do not have the kind of resources that the industrial countries have to be able to switch from the carbon economy to renewables economy as such. They are themselves, the industrial countries, having consumed 70% of what we call the carbon budget, of where we will reach the 1.5 degree
temperature
line. They are themselves not up to speed in terms of implementing their commitments to transition away from the fossil fuel economy as such. And they are also not yet providing the kind of financial support, the technological support, which will be required by developing countries in order to transition from the carbon economy to the renewables economy. It will be a long process, but we will require the funds, the technology, and the capacity to be able to make the transition. One of the initiatives which Pakistan has taken at the United Nations is to call for a facility for investment in sustainable infrastructure.
Right.
Energy, transportation, etc. We are pursuing that at the United Nations level in order to assist, and the aim is to mobilize the finance on the one side, but on the other side to enable developing countries to prepare projects for sustainable infrastructure and to mobilize the investment into those projects. This is a work in progress,
right?
But this is one of the initiatives that Pakistan has taken here, and we are leading that group. We are also leading a separate group on promoting finance for development.
Finance for development, yes, indeed. So before we conclude, because we have a lot of people in Pakistan and South Asia would be hearing you. So one impression that is often, and I'm sure you read in our op-eds and TV discussions, is that Pakistan is not getting the kind of international support on issues that it promotes. I mean, you are here in the UN for long. This is your second stint. You've been in other multilateral settings. How far is that impression correct? Is it true that Pakistan is relatively isolated than before or not? I'd like to hear you. I know this is not an easy one to address.
No, it's very easy.
Okay.
Pakistan is not isolated. Far from it. Especially if you look at the United Nations, we have chairman of the group of 77.
Correct.
Twice. We have been on Security Council 7 times. We have been president of the Economic and Social Council 6 times. Pakistan is unopposed for election to the Security Council, which will happen this June. And we will be on the Security Council next year as such. We are leading the group of like-minded countries here negotiating the Summit of the Future. We are helping the Secretary General formulate various plans that he has, and we are closely consulted by the Secretary General. I meet him almost every week, every second week. How is Pakistan isolated? When we had a disaster, the Secretary General rushed to Pakistan to be there and to help us in our hour of need. He helped us to mobilize the $10 billion plus that we received in reconstruction assistance. The General Assembly passed a unanimous resolution expressing its solidarity and support for Pakistan in the wake of that disaster as such. We are respected by the East, by the West, by the North, by the South. We have good relations here with every delegation as such. How are we isolated?
No, that's a great final comment. Thank you so much, Ambassador Akram.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.